The Pacific is not just a place, it is a vast blue silence that covers 1/3 of our planet. In 1768, it was the final frontier of the human map. Welcome to Midnight Voyager. Tonight we travel aboard the HMS Endeavour with James Cook, on a journey that would redefine the boundaries of the world. Before we weigh anchor, if you find peace in these journeys into the past, consider subscribing to chart the course with us. It helps us continue to map the unknown. For now, settle in, adjust your volume, and prepare for the long voyage ahead. To understand the voyage of the Endeavour, one must first understand the silence of James Cook. He was a man born of the soil, not the sea. In 1728, in the mud-flecked village of Marton, Yorkshire, Cook entered a world where a boy's destiny was usually no wider than the field he ploughed. He was the son of a farm labourer, a member of the vast, invisible underclass of 18th century England. Yet James Cook possessed a mind like a diamond, hard, clear, and capable of cutting through the most complex problems of the age. Physically, he was a formidable presence, standing over 6 feet tall, a height that made him a giant among the cramped, malnourished sailors of the Royal Navy. He was lean and plain-featured. He did not possess the easy, aristocratic grace of the officers he served under. He did not have their connections, their wealth, or their polished rhetoric. Instead, he had a stiff quality, a stoicism that some took for coldness, but others recognised as the absolute self-control required to lead men into the void. Cook was a tarpaulin officer, a man who had risen through the ranks by the sheer merit of his mathematics. While other young men were carousing in the ports, Cook was in the cabin of a North Sea collier, teaching himself Euclidean geometry and spherical trigonometry by the light of a tallow candle. He didn't just sail ships. He understood the physics of the water they displaced and the mechanics of the stars that guided them. The genius of Cook lay in his discipline. In an era of the British Navy defined by the lash, press gangs, and the casual brutality of the sea, Cook brought a revolutionary kind of order. It was not a cruel order, but a scientific one. He was a man of the middle way. He was rarely given to fits of rage, yet he was never truly one of the men. He inhabited a lonely space on the quarterdeck, a man who observed everything and revealed nothing. There is a specific kind of courage required for what Cook was about to do. It is not the hot, impulsive courage of the soldier in a bayonet charge. It is the cold, enduring courage of the surveyor. To sail a heavy, slow-moving coal ship into uncharted waters, knowing that a single hidden reef could tear the bottom out of your world 5,000 miles from the nearest help, requires a psyche made of iron. He was a man who trusted only what he could measure. To Cook, the Pacific was not a place of myths or sea monsters. It was a grid of latitude and longitude waiting to be filled. He was the greatest surveyor in Europe, a man who could look at a coastline and translate its jagged reality into a perfect two-dimensional truth on a piece of vellum. But beneath the stoic exterior was a man driven by a quiet, restless ambition. He was the perfect instrument for the Enlightenment, an age that believed the entire universe could be catalogued, weighed, and understood. As he stood on the deck of the Endeavour in Plymouth Sound, he was 40 years old. He had a wife and children in London whom he would not see for years. He had no guarantee of fame. He had only his charts, his sextant, and a ship that smelled of coal and fresh timber. James Cook was about to take the measure of the world, and in doing so, he would become the most famous navigator in human history. Not because he was the loudest or the most daring, but because he was the most precise. To the eyes of the 18th century maritime elite, the vessel moored at the Deptford naval dockyards in early 1768 was an object of derision. She was not the sleek, copper-bottomed frigate one would associate with a voyage of discovery. She was a cat-built bark, formerly named the Earl of Pembroke, a common North Sea collier built in the yards of Whitby. She was chunky, square-sterned, and lacked the predatory grace of the Royal Navy's warships. But James Cook did not want grace, he wanted survival. The choice of the Endeavour, as she was renamed upon her purchase by the Navy for £2,840, was the first stroke of Cook's genius. He knew the Whitby ships. He had spent his youth in their cramped holds, hauling coal from the Tyne to the Thames. These ships were designed for two things: carrying immense weight and surviving the brutal shallows of the English coast. A Collier's hull was broad and flat-bottomed. This meant that if the Endeavour were to run aground on an uncharted reef in the Pacific, she would not tip and shatter like a deep-keeled warship. She could take the ground upright. She was a beast of burden capable of carrying 368 tons of stores, scientific equipment and 94 souls into a void where no resupply existed. The refit at Deptford was a masterpiece of 18th century engineering. The shipwright sheathed her hull in a second skin of thin planking, a sacrificial layer filled with thousands of broad-headed scupper nails. This was the only defence against the Teredo Navalis, the dreaded shipworm that could turn a solid oak hull into a honeycomb of brittle dust in tropical waters. They reinforced her timbers, added a third mast, and carved out a cramped laboratory for the scientists, men whose presence turned this merchant vessel into a floating university. While the shipwrights hammered, the Royal Society finalised the mission's intellectual core. The year 1769 offered a rare celestial event, the transit of Venus. To the Enlightenment mind, this was the holy grail of navigation. By timing the exact second the silhouette of Venus touched the limb of the sun from various points on Earth, mathematicians could use parallax to determine the scale of the solar system. The Admiralty provided the muscle, but the Royal Society provided the mind. They sent Charles Green, an astronomer of exacting standards, and Joseph Banks, a young, wealthy botanist whose personal fortune exceeded the cost of the ship itself. Banks brought a retinue of artists and scientists, along with 2 greyhounds, a library of botanical texts, and the latest chemical preservatives. Cook, the son of a farmhand, now found himself the commander of a vessel where the gentleman scientists held social rank, but he held the ultimate authority of the sea. It was a delicate social architecture, built on the mutual understanding that if the math failed, they would all vanish. Perhaps the most critical refit occurred not in the wood of the ship, but in its hold. Cook was a veteran of long campaigns, and he knew that the greatest threat to the voyage was not the Spanish Navy or sea monsters, but scurvy. In the 1760s, scurvy was the Black Death of the sea. It began with lethargy, followed by the reopening of old wounds, the loss of teeth, and eventually, a gruesome death from internal hemorrhaging. Cook approached scurvy with the same cold analytical rigour he applied to the stars. He stocked the Endeavour with 7,860 pounds of sauerkraut and dozens of casks of malt wort and rob of lemon and orange. He knew sailors were traditionally conservative, often refusing any food that wasn't salted beef or hardtack. Cook's solution was psychological. He ordered the sauerkraut to be served daily to the officers' table. Seeing their superiors eat it with apparent relish, the crew soon began to demand their own rations. It was a masterclass in leadership. He didn't command them to be healthy, he made health a matter of status. On the 26th of August, 1768, the Endeavour slipped her moorings at Plymouth. As the ship cleared the breakwater, the rhythm of the voyage began. The cat-built bark moved heavily through the swells, her timbers groaning under the weight of 18 months of flour, spirits and salt meat. Cook stood on the quarterdeck, a tall, silent figure, watching the English coastline dissolve into the mist. He carried with him 2 sets of instructions from the Admiralty. The first was public: sail to Tahiti, observe the transit of Venus, and return. The second was a secret instruction, sealed in a lead-weighted packet, to be opened only when the first task was complete. It contained orders that would change the map of the world forever. The Endeavour was now a sovereign entity, a tiny speck of British law, an Enlightenment curiosity moving into the vast grey Atlantic. The quiet moments had begun. The long weeks of salt spray, the constant calculation of the dead reckoning, and the slow, steady ticking of the marine chronometer. The voyage had truly started. James Cook was no longer a surveyor of the coast. He was the master of the unknown. As the English Channel gave way to the long rhythmic swells of the North Atlantic, the 94 men aboard the Endeavour began the slow process of dissolving their ties to the land. For a sailor in 1768, the departure from home was a form of temporary death. There were no letters, no updates, no certainty of return. There was only the ship, a 100-foot world of oak, hemp and salt. The first weeks were a trial of the senses. The Endeavour, heavily laden with 18 months of stores, did not so much sail as plough through the water. Below decks the atmosphere was thick. It was a sensory tapestry of 18th century naval life. The sharp medicinal tang of vinegar used to wash the beams, the earthy scent of the thousands of onions hanging in nets, and the ever-present smell of Stockholm tar and wet wool. Cook maintained a rhythmic, unyielding discipline. The crew was divided into 2 watches, alternating 4 hours on and 4 hours off. The ship's bell became the heartbeat of their existence, marking the passage of time in a world where the horizon never changed. In September, the Endeavour made landfall at Funchal, Madeira. To the modern ear, a stop in the Madeira Islands sounds like a luxury. To Cook, it was a logistical necessity. Here, the science of survival was put into practice. He took on 3,000 gallons of fortified wine. Not merely for morale, but because water in wooden casks inevitably turned foul, and alcohol was the only reliable preservative. He also loaded fresh beef, water, and vast quantities of fruit. It was here that the first tragedy of the voyage struck. Not from storm or battle, but from the mundane hazards of the sea. A seaman named Isaac Smith was caught in a coil of rope as the anchor was being raised and was hauled overboard. In the cold, churning waters of the harbour, he vanished. Cook's log entry was brief, a stoic acknowledgement of the price of the sea. The voyage moved on. In 1768, longitude, the ability to know exactly how far east or west you were, was still the greatest challenge in navigation. While the legendary Harrison chronometers existed, they were not yet standard issue. Cook relied on lunar distances. This required an intellect of the highest order. At night, Charles Green, the astronomer, and Cook would stand on the heaving quarterdeck with their sextants, measuring the angle between the moon and specific clock stars. These measurements were then put through hours of grueling manual calculation using the nautical almanac. To watch them was to watch 2 men trying to solve a cosmic puzzle while standing on a moving pendulum. This was the Enlightenment at work. The belief that through math and observation, the chaotic, trackless ocean could be tamed into a series of coordinates. Crossing the equator brought the Endeavour into the doldrums, the intertropical convergence zone. Here the winds died, and the Atlantic became a mirror of polished lead. The heat was oppressive. The ship's timbers shrank and groaned. The portable soup in the hold softened into a gluey mass. To prevent the crew from succumbing to the lethargy that often preceded disease, Cook enforced a regime of cleanliness. He ordered the decks scrubbed with vinegar and the 'tween decks smoked with brimstone to kill the miasmas they believed carried sickness. Joseph Banks and his botanists, meanwhile, found wonder in the stagnation. They lowered small nets into the glass calm water, pulling up luminous jellyfish and strange iridescent sea creatures that had never been catalogued by European science. For Banks, the ocean was a garden. For Cook, it was a problem of wind and friction. In November, the Endeavour reached Rio de Janeiro, then a jewel of the Portuguese Empire. Here, Cook encountered a different kind of obstacle: human suspicion. The Portuguese viceroy could not believe that a Collier filled with scientists was on a mission to observe the stars. He suspected they were spies or smugglers. For weeks, the Endeavour was treated as a floating prison. Cook was forbidden from landing. His officers were harassed. It was a test of his temperament. A more hot-headed commander might have threatened the fort with his cannons, but Cook remained measured. He focused on the repairs, secretly sending Banks's artists ashore, disguised as common sailors to sketch the local flora. He was a man who knew how to wait. He knew that the Pacific didn't care about Portuguese politics. By December, as they moved further south, the air turned brittle and cold. The silk waistcoats of the gentlemen were replaced by heavy, fear not jackets. They were approaching the most feared coordinates on the globe, Cape Horn. The Atlantic was behind them. Ahead lay the Southern Ocean, a place where the winds have the entire circumference of the Earth to gather speed, unobstructed by land. The Endeavour, the little coal ship from Whitby, was about to enter the gates of the Pacific. Cook checked his charts, Green cleaned his lenses, and the crew tightened the rigging. The quiet of the Atlantic was over. The true scale of their isolation was about to be revealed. By the dawn of January 1769, the Endeavour had left the humid, suspicious air of Brazil far behind. The sun, once a blistering weight overhead, now hung low and pale on the northern horizon. The world was turning grey. This was the transition from the Atlantic to the Southern Ocean, a region where the geography of the Earth narrows into a choke point of rock and ice. The roaring 40s began to make their presence felt. For the men on the watch, the work changed. The rigging, once supple with oil and warmth, grew stiff and treacherous with frost. The cat-built bark, though sturdy, was tossed like a cork in the massive long-period swells that travel thousands of miles around the bottom of the globe. In mid-January, the lookout cried out. Rising from the mist were the jagged black spires of Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. To the 18th century sailor, this was the edge of the living world. The coast was a desolate architecture of dark cliffs and stunted, wind-beaten trees. Cook, ever the surveyor, did not simply pass by. He needed water, wood, and a final chance to check his instruments before committing to the Pacific. He steered the Endeavour into the Bay of Success. Here the first major cultural encounter of the voyage occurred. As the boats pulled towards the shingle beach, a group of the local indigenous people, the Haush, appeared from the brush. They were tall, draped in guanaco skins, their bodies painted with red ochre and white clay. Following the Admiralty's strict instructions to cultivate a friendship with any native peoples, Cook landed personally. In his journals, he noted their resilience to the cold with a mixture of wonder and stoicism. While the British sailors shivered in multiple layers of fear-not wool, the Haush stood comfortably in the sleet. There was no conflict, only a silent, wary exchange of beads and iron for information that neither side truly understood. It was here, amidst the scientific curiosity of the landing, that the voyage suffered its first profound loss. Joseph Banks, driven by an insatiable need to catalogue every leaf and lichen, led a party of 12 men inland towards the snowy peaks. Among them were his two black servants, Richmond and Dalton. The weather in Tierra del Fuego is a capricious killer. Within hours, a mild afternoon collapsed into a blinding sub-Antarctic blizzard. The party became disoriented in the thickets of birch. Dr. Solander, the experienced naturalist, began to succumb to the death sleep of hypothermia. Banks managed to keep the group moving, but the two servants, Richmond and Dalton, grew exhausted. They found a stash of rum, the sailors' only comfort, and drank to numb the cold. It was a fatal mistake. As the temperature plummeted, they fell into a stupor from which they would never wake. When the sun rose over a world of white, Banks had to lead the survivors back to the ship, leaving the two men behind in the snow. It was a sobering reminder to the gentlemen scientists. The Enlightenment was a fragile shield against the raw indifference of the elements. Cook recorded the deaths in the ship's log with his usual brevity, but the mood on the Endeavour had shifted. The Pacific was demanding its first tithe. On January 26th, the Endeavour weighed anchor and headed for the Horn. Cape Horn is the graveyard of the age of sail. It is where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide in a chaos of rogue waves and conflicting currents. Most captains spent weeks, sometimes months, beating against the wind, their crews shattered by the effort of tacking in hurricane-force gales. But Cook was a master of the westward drift. He did not hug the coast. He stayed south, deep in the cold, using his merchant-trained intuition to find the seams in the weather. Remarkably, the Endeavour doubled the Horn in a mere 33 days. Cook's log during this period is a study in 18th century professional pride. While he acknowledged the heavy seas and the prodigious mountains of water, he focused on the physics of the ship. He noted how the Collier's broad hull resisted the broaching that might have sunk a faster vessel. On the 30th of January, the Endeavour turned her head to the northwest. The jagged rocks of the Horn faded into the wake. The ship had entered the Pacific Ocean, the Great South Sea. Before them lay 15 million square miles of water. To the men on deck, the horizon looked the same as the Atlantic, but the math told a different story. They were now in a realm of myth. The maps in Cook's cabin showed vast empty spaces labelled with the guesses of previous explorers. Islands seen once and never found again, and the persistent ghost of the southern continent. Cook ordered the slops, the crew's clothing, to be aired and the ship scrubbed with vinegar. They were heading for the tropics. The bitter cold of the Horn was replaced by a rising warmth, and the heavy wool jackets were stowed away. The science of the transit was now only weeks away. Tahiti lay somewhere ahead in the blue. For the first time, the men began to see the birds of the sea, petrels and albatrosses, that signalled the proximity of land. The Endeavour was a lonely speck in the largest void on Earth, governed by the ticking of the watch and the silent, towering ambition of the man on the quarterdeck. By April 1769, the Endeavour had been at sea for nearly 8 months. The brutal, salt-crusted memory of Cape Horn had begun to fade, replaced by a humid, heavy heat that permeated the oak timbers of the ship. On the 13th of April, the lookout's cry broke the morning stillness. The jagged emerald peaks of Otaheite, modern-day Tahiti, had pierced the horizon. For the 94 men aboard, the sight was a hallucination of colour. After months of grey-blue monotony, they were confronted with a landscape of impossible greens and the white, crashing lace of the barrier reefs. But James Cook did not see a paradise. He saw a laboratory. He had a deadline set by the celestial clockwork of the solar system. The transit of Venus was less than 2 months away. As the Endeavour navigated the breaks in the reef and dropped anchor in Matavai Bay, the ship was immediately surrounded by hundreds of outrigger canoes. This was not a discovery in the eyes of the Tahitians. They had encountered Europeans before. The Dolphin under Captain Wallis had arrived only 2 years prior. Cook's approach to this encounter was characterised by his Yorkshire pragmatism. He issued a set of rules to be observed by every person in or belonging to His Majesty's bark, the Endeavour, establishing a strict code of trade. He knew that if the crew were allowed to strip the ship of its iron nails to trade for the favours of the local women, as they had on previous voyages, the Endeavour would literally fall apart in the middle of the Pacific. He met the local chiefs, including the formidable Queen Purea and the high priest and navigator Tupia. In Tupia, Cook found a mirror of himself, a man who understood the stars not through the lens of a telescope, but through the lived experience of the currents and the wayfinding of his ancestors. It was a meeting of 2 different scientific worlds, one of paper and ink, the other of memory and wind. To observe the transit, Cook needed stability. A ship at anchor, swaying with the tide, was a poor platform for a telescope. He ordered the construction of a land-based observatory on the northern point of the bay, a place they named Point Venus. The construction of Fort Venus was a marvel of 18th century field engineering. Under the direction of the ship's carpenters and marines, they built a defensive perimeter of earthworks, gabions and palisades. Inside this mobile base, they erected the astronomical clocks, the quadrants, and the heavy telescopes provided by the Royal Society. The atmosphere inside the fort was a mixture of a military garrison and a university. While Marines stood guard with muskets to protect the equipment from theft, a constant source of tension, as the Tahitians had a different concept of property. Charles Green and James Cook spent their nights in the quiet moments, calibrating the instruments by the light of tallow candles. The sensory world of the fort was one of coconut oil, wood smoke, and the rhythmic metallic ticking of the marine chronometer. The morning of June 3rd, 1769, dawned with a clarity that felt like a divine favour. The heat was immense. Cook, Green and Solander split into 3 groups to ensure that if a single cloud passed over one telescope, another might catch the data. The science for sleep becomes the science of the infinitesimal. For 6 hours the men sat in the blistering heat, their eyes pressed against the lenses. They watched for the first contact, the moment the black silhouette of Venus first notched the perfect gold circle of the sun. Then came the black drop effect. As Venus fully entered the sun's disk, a dark ligament seemed to connect the planet to the edge of the sun, making it impossible to record the exact second of transition with the precision the Royal Society demanded. Cook's journals reflect a rare moment of scientific frustration. He had sailed halfway around the world, built a fort, and managed 90 men, only to be defied by an optical illusion of the atmosphere. Nevertheless, the data was collected. They had successfully captured the transit. The primary public mission of the voyage was complete. As the telescopes were packed back into their padded crates, and the earthworks of Fort Venus were levelled, a shift occurred in the mood of the commander. The quiet of Tahiti, the nights of music, the scent of hibiscus, and the diplomatic dances with the chiefs was over. Cook now turned his attention to the lead-weighted packet from the Admiralty. He broke the wax seal. The secret instructions were explicit. He was not to return home. Instead, he was to sail south into the deep, cold latitudes to search for the great southern continent. If no continent was found, he was to head west to explore the land discovered by the Dutchman Abel Tasman over a century before. On the 13th of July, the Endeavour weighed anchor. They took with them Tupia, who joined the crew as a translator and navigator. As the emerald peaks of Otaheite vanished into the sea, the men looked south. The warmth was behind them. The unknown lay ahead. Cook stood on the quarterdeck, his mind already calculating the drift, the stores, and the geometry of a world that was about to get much, much larger. In July 1769, as the Endeavour cleared the reefs of Tahiti, the ship's mission underwent a fundamental transformation. To the crew, it might have felt like the beginning of the journey home. To James Cook, it was the start of the real work. With the transit of Venus recorded, Cook broke the seal on his secret instructions. The document, written in the elegant, cold hand of the Admiralty, ordered him to sail south as far as 40 degrees latitude in search of Terra Australis Incognita. If no land was found, he was to turn west and locate the shaky eastern coast of the land discovered by the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1642. The Endeavour turned her bow into the vast empty South Pacific. The warmth of the tropics evaporated, replaced by a biting, salt-laden wind. The science for sleep here is the science of the dead reckoning. In this trackless expanse, Cook's primary task was the constant, rhythmic calculation of position. Every hour, the log ship, a wooden board on a knotted line, was tossed overboard to measure the vessel's speed. Every noon, if the sun broke through the grey overcast, the sextants were out. As they pushed south, the quiet moments were filled with a growing tension. The sea grew mountainously large. The men watched the horizon for the signs of land, described by ancient navigators, specific clouds, floating weeds, or the flight patterns of birds. But there was nothing. The southern continent, that great weight of logic that philosophers believed must exist to balance the world, was proving to be a ghost. By early October, they had reached the limits of their southern push without sighting anything but the endless churning whitecaps of the Southern Ocean. Cook, ever the pragmatist, did not waste time mourning a myth. He turned the Endeavour westward. On the 6th of October, 1769, a 12-year-old boy named Nicholas Young, standing high in the rigging, caught a glimpse of something through the haze, a jagged dark line against the clouds. This was young Nick's head, the first sight of what we now know as New Zealand. To the men on the Endeavour, this was a moment of profound relief. They believed they had finally found the continent. But as the ship approached the coast of the North Island, they realised this was no gentle, pastoral land. It was a landscape of towering, snow-capped mountains and impenetrable forests, a place of raw, volcanic energy. The first encounter with the Maori at a place Cook named Poverty Bay was a stark departure from the diplomatic ease of Tahiti. As the boats pulled towards the shore, they were met by warriors performing a haka, a display of rhythmic, terrifying physical defiance. Cook, following his instructions to avoid bloodshed, tried to initiate trade, but the cultural gap was immense. The Maori saw the Endeavour as a floating island or a supernatural vessel. The British saw a primitive people to be catalogued. In a series of tragic misunderstandings over a boat and a piece of cloth, several Maori were shot. Cook's journals reflect a deep intellectual brooding over these events. He was not a man of casual violence. He noted the intrepidity of the Maori, admiring their courage even as he lamented the necessity of his muskets. This was the burden of the Enlightenment explorer. The desire for knowledge often required the presence of force. For the next 6 months, Cook performed what remains one of the greatest feats of cartography in maritime history. He began a circumnavigation of the 2 islands of New Zealand. While the ship groaned under the strain of the southern gales, Cook sat in his cabin, translating the jagged reality of the coastline into a perfect map. He found the strait that now bears his name, Cook Strait, proving that New Zealand was not part of a continent, but 2 distinct islands. The sensory world of this period was one of cold rain and the constant shredding of sails. The crew lived on wild celery and scurvy grass gathered from the shore, Cook's relentless health regime continuing even in the face of Maori hostility. Joseph Banks, meanwhile, was in a fever of discovery. Every time the ship anchored, he was ashore, collecting specimens of the pohutukawa and the giant ferns, filling the Endeavour with the damp, earthy scent of a world that had evolved in total isolation for millions of years. By March 1770, the chart of New Zealand was complete. It was a masterpiece of accuracy, so precise that it would be used by navigators for over a century. Cook now faced a choice. He could return home via Cape Horn, retracing his steps, or he could sail west toward the unknown New Holland, Australia, and see if there was a passage to the north. He consulted his officers. The Endeavour was showing her age, her sails were patched, and her rigging was worn thin by the Pacific salt. But the allure of the unknown was too strong. On the 31st of March, Cook turned his ship towards the setting sun. Behind them lay the shaky isles. Ahead lay a coast that no European had ever seen, the final great barrier between the Pacific and home. By April 1770, the Endeavour was a weary vessel. The white paint of her hull was stained with the rust of iron bolts and the green weep of tropical algae. Her sails were a patchwork of different canvases, stitched together in the quiet moments of the mid-watch. As they left the jagged peaks of New Zealand behind, they steered into a stretch of ocean that was quite literally off the map. On the 19th of April, Lieutenant Zachary Hicks, standing on the dawn watch, sighted land. It was not the dramatic vertical mountains of New Zealand, but a low, sloping coastline of pale scrub and grey-green trees. Cook named the point Point Hicks. They had reached the eastern coast of New Holland, the continent we now call Australia. For over a week, Cook tracked the coast northward, searching for a safe harbour. On the 29th of April, he found a broad, shallow inlet. As the boats were lowered and the oars began to rhythmically dip into the turquoise water, 2 indigenous men appeared on the rocks of the southern point. They were Guigal people of the Darawal nation. Unlike the Maori, who had met the British with a collective haka, these men stood in a silence that was even more profound. They waved long wooden spears and gestured for the strangers to be gone. When the British boats touched the sand, a brief skirmish ensued, a few stones thrown, a light bird shot fired, and then the two men faded back into the bush. Cook stepped onto the shore of what he would first call Stingray Harbour, later renamed Botany Bay. The sensory experience of this place was unlike anything the crew had encountered. The air was dry and carried the sharp medicinal scent of eucalyptus, a smell that would forever after define the Australian continent for the British. The birds were not the muted greys of Europe, but flashes of neon crimson and sulphur yellow, their calls sounding like the mechanical grinding of gears. For Joseph Banks and Dr. Solander, Botany Bay was a biological fever dream. While Cook and his master's mates were busy surveying the bay and calculating the tides, Banks was on shore from dawn until dusk. The science for sleep here is the science of taxonomy. In the 18th century, the world was believed to follow a great chain of being, but Australia defied the chain. Banks found plants with woody, cone-like fruits that seemed to require fire to open. He found monstrous creatures that hopped on two legs with the speed of a horse, the kangaroo. Inside the Endeavour, the great cabin became a forest of drying paper and pressed leaves. The scent of the ship changed from salt and tar to the sweet earthy smell of drying botanical specimens. Over 3,000 new species were catalogued in those few weeks. Banks was ecstatic, but Cook was focused on the water. He noted in his journal that while the land was finely diversified, it was also excessively dry. He was looking for a river, a source of life that seemed to be hiding from him. As the crew gathered wood and water, they were constantly watched. The indigenous people did not seek conflict, but they did not seek trade either. They appeared like shadows at the edge of the woods and vanished when approached. Cook's observations of the Guigal are among the most insightful and debated in his journals. He wrote, "They may appear to some to be the most wretched people upon earth, but in reality they are far more happier than we Europeans. They live in a tranquility which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition." It was a rare moment of philosophical reflection from a man who usually only dealt in numbers. He recognised a society that wanted nothing the British had to offer. No beads, no iron, no cloth. It was a total rejection of the Enlightenment's value system. On the 7th of May, the Endeavour weighed anchor and continued her northward trek. Cook was charting a coast that seemed to go on forever. To his left was a wall of green and grey. To his right, the open Pacific. But as they crossed the Tropic of Capricorn, the geography began to change. The water turned a pale milky blue. The waves grew shorter and more erratic. Without knowing it, Cook was sailing into the narrowing funnel between the mainland and the Great Barrier Reef. The quiet moments on deck became infused with a new kind of anxiety. The lead line was cast constantly. By the deep 11, the leadsman would cry, marking the depth in fathoms. The water was shallowing. The ship was entering a labyrinth of coral, a 1,000-mile graveyard of sharp, prehistoric limestone that no European chart had ever recorded. Cook stood on the quarterdeck, his eyes narrowed against the tropical glare. He was moving a heavy coal ship through a minefield of stone. The mathematics of the stars were no longer enough. He needed the intuition of the tarpaulin captain. He was about to face the greatest crisis of his life. By June 1770, the Endeavour had been following the Australian coast for nearly 2,000 miles. The heat was now a constant, oppressive companion, and the air was thick with the scent of the tropical north, a mixture of salt, rotting mangroves, and the dry breath of the interior. Cook was navigating through a nightmare of hydrography. He was trapped between the mainland and the Great Barrier Reef, though he did not yet know the scale of the structure he was inside. The water was a treacherous palette of pale turquoises and deep cobalts, hiding bommies, massive columns of coral that could rise from the seabed to the surface in a matter of feet. The evening of June 11th was a clear, moonlit night. The ship was under easy sail, moving at about 3 or 4 knots. Cook had seen no signs of danger. The lead man was consistently calling out depths of 17 to 20 fathoms. Then the water began to shallow with terrifying speed. At 10 p.m, the leadsman cried out, 11 fathoms! Before the next cast could be made, the Endeavour struck. There was no sudden crash, but a sickening, grinding sound that vibrated through every timber of the ship. The cat-built bark, designed for the soft mud of the North Sea, had been impaled on a spur of razor-sharp coral. The ship shuddered and came to a dead halt. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the Pacific surf crashing against the reef just a few hundred yards away. Cook was on deck in seconds. He was a man of the middle way, and in this moment of extreme crisis, his stoicism became the ship's anchor. There was no panic. He ordered the sails to be furled and the boats lowered to sound the water around the ship. They were hard aground on a ledge of coral. To get her off, they had to make the ship lighter, immediately. In the moonlight, the crew began a frantic rhythmic labour. They threw overboard everything that wasn't essential for survival. Iron ballast, heavy casks of spoiled meat, and even the precious deck guns. The 4-pounders that represented the ship's only defence were heaved into the dark water. In total, nearly 50 tons of equipment were sacrificed to the reef. Despite their efforts, the tide went out, leaving the Endeavour perched precariously on the coral. The hull began to groan as the weight of the ship, no longer supported by the water, pressed down on the sharp stone. Water began to pour into the hold. The pumps were manned. For 24 hours the men worked in shifts, their muscles screaming, their hands blistered by the rough handles of the iron pumps. But the leak was winning. The water in the hold was rising faster than they could pump it out. It was then that Midshipman Jonathan Monkhouse proposed a technique from the old merchant navy, feathering. They took a large studding sail and thrummed it, stitching handfuls of chopped rope, wool, and even sheep's dung onto one side. They then lowered this hairy sail under the hull of the ship. The suction of the leak pulled the sail against the hull, and the tangled fibres were sucked into the gash in the wood, creating a temporary, miraculous seal. The pumping finally began to gain ground. The Endeavour was still wounded, but she was afloat. For the next 6 days, the ship limped toward the coast, a skeleton of herself. Cook found a small opening in the mangroves, a river mouth he named the Endeavour River, near modern-day Cooktown. They careened the ship, hauling her onto her side on the sandy beach to reveal the damage. The sight was sobering. A massive piece of coral, the size of a man's fist, had broken off and remained wedged in the hull. It was this plug of stone, combined with the fothering sail, that had kept them from sinking in the middle of the Pacific. For 7 weeks the crew lived on the shore while the carpenters worked. This quiet moment was a period of intense scientific observation. It was here that they saw the kangaroo in detail for the first time, and where Joseph Banks recorded the word "ganguru" from the local Gugu Yimithir people. By early August, the ship was repaired, but the greatest challenge remained. They were still inside the reef. Cook spent days in a small boat, searching for a pass through the coral wall. He finally found a narrow opening, Providential Channel. With the wind at her back, the Endeavour surged through the gap and back into the deep, dark blue of the open Pacific. Cook's log that night reflected a rare moment of emotion. It is a happiness not possessed by many to be able to say they have been within a hair's breadth of destruction and are now in safety. He had survived the labyrinth. He had saved his ship, his crew, and his charts, but the toll was heavy. The Endeavour was no longer the sturdy Collier that had left Plymouth. She was a battered survivor, and the long road home through the Dutch East Indies was about to prove more deadly than any reef. The Endeavour had survived the jagged teeth of the Great Barrier Reef, but the ship that emerged into the Arafura Sea was a ghost of her former self. Her timbers were strained, her rigging was brittle from the tropical sun, and her hull was held together by the grace of the carpenters and a plug of coral. Cook steered her through the Torres Strait, proving that New Guinea and New Holland were separate, and turned toward the civilized world, the Dutch stronghold of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. Up to this point, Cook's miracle was his crew's health. In over 2 years of sailing the most dangerous waters on Earth, he had not lost a single man to scurvy. It was an unprecedented achievement in naval history. But as the Endeavour dropped anchor in the stagnant, shimmering heat of Batavia's harbour in October 1770, they encountered a killer that no amount of sauerkraut could defeat. Batavia was the Queen of the East, a city of Dutch canals, stone warehouses, and immense wealth. But to the men of the Endeavour, it was a sensory nightmare. The air was thick, humid and heavy, with the scent of open sores and rotting tropical vegetation. The science for sleep here is the science of epidemiology. In the 18th century, the germ theory did not exist. Doctors believed in miasma, that diseases like malaria and dysentery were carried by bad air. Batavia was the world capital of bad air. The city was a breeding ground for the Anopheles mosquito and the waterborne bacteria of the canals. Within a week of arrival, the crew began to collapse. The quiet moments on deck were now filled with the sound of laboured breathing and the low moans of men in the grip of high fevers. The irony was bitter. After surviving the unknown Pacific, the crew was being decimated by the known world. Joseph Banks and Dr. Solander nearly died. The ship's surgeon, Monkhouse, who had helped save the ship on the reef, was one of the first to succumb. Cook himself, for the first time in the voyage, expressed a sense of helplessness in his journals. He watched as his disciplined, hardy crew, men who had stood firm against Maori warriors and the Great Barrier Reef, withered away. He recorded the deaths with a heavy rhythmic regularity. Mr. Green, the astronomer, Tupia, the Tahitian priest, Taieto, his servant, and dozens of seamen. The science of the transit had cost them their astronomer. The science of navigation had cost them their best navigator. Of the 94 men who had left Plymouth, barely half were fit for duty. While the crew died in the shoreside tents, the Endeavour was hauled into the Dutch shipyards at Onrust Island. The Dutch shipwrights were masters of their craft, but they were shocked by what they found. When they stripped away the futhering sail, they found the hull was thin as a shoe sole. It was a miracle the ship hadn't foundered in the open sea. For the survivors, the work was a blur of heat and grief. They replaced the rotted planks and reinforced the frame. Cook, stoic as ever, oversaw the repairs while managing the logistics of a dying crew. He bought fresh supplies, but the fresh water of Batavia was often as lethal as the air. On the 26th of December, 1770, the Endeavour finally weighed anchor and turned her head toward the Indian Ocean. They left Batavia as a hospital ship. The scent of the city, that heavy, cloying smell of spices and decay, lingered in the hold. The passage across the Indian Ocean towards the Cape of Good Hope was a slow, agonising funeral procession. Day after day, the all-hands call was not for work, but for the burial of a comrade. Between Batavia and the Cape, 23 more men died. The science for sleep here is the rhythm of the ocean as a funerary march, the creak of the ship, the slap of the water against the hull, and the silence of the empty hammocks below decks. James Cook, the son of a labourer who had aimed to measure the stars, was now measuring the loss of his world. He had mapped continents, but he could not map a way out of the fever. As the Cape of Good Hope finally rose out of the mist in March 1771, the Endeavour was a vessel of survivors. They were the hard remnants, men who had seen the edge of the world and the bottom of the grave, and were now finally turning toward home. By the spring of 1771, the Endeavour had become a creature of the deep Atlantic once more. But she was not the same ship that had left Plymouth 3 years prior. Her hull was a patchwork of English oak, New Zealand timber and Dutch tropical hardwood. Her crew was a skeletal assembly of survivors and replacements picked up in Batavia and the Cape. As they crossed the equator for the final time, heading north, the science for sleep returns to the quiet, rhythmic anticipation of the homecoming. The air grew cooler, the humidity of the East Indies giving way to the brisk, salt-scented winds of the mid-Atlantic. Cook, ever the disciplinarian of health, ordered the last of the portable soup and sauerkraut to be consumed. He would bring his remaining men home standing upright. On the 10th of July, 1771, the lookout called out a name that every man on board had carried in his heart like a talisman: the Lizard, the southernmost point of Cornwall, England. As the green cliffs of the English coast rose out of the morning mist, the sensory world of the voyage shifted one last time. The smell of the Pacific, of hibiscus, drying coral, and eucalyptus, was replaced by the smell of damp earth, coal smoke, and the cold, grey rain of the Channel. On the 13th of July, the Endeavour dropped anchor in the Downs. James Cook, the farmhand's son, stepped off the boat and onto English soil for the first time in 1,051 days. He carried with him a chest of charts that would fundamentally redraw the shape of the Earth. The return was not the thunderous celebration one might expect. In the 18th century, news travelled at the speed of a horse. Cook's first act was to send his journals and maps to the Admiralty. The science of the voyage was now being weighed by the masters of the Enlightenment. The transit of Venus data was handed to the Royal Society. Joseph Banks, with his thousands of specimens and exotic sketches, became an overnight sensation, the celebrity scientist of his age. But for Cook, the legacy was in the negative space. He had proven that the great southern continent, as imagined by the armchair philosophers, did not exist. He had replaced a myth with a reality: the intricate, jagged coastlines of New Zealand and the vast, dry expanse of New South Wales. He had turned the Great South Sea from a mystery into a measured, navigable reality. James Cook was promoted to commander. He was presented to King George III, but he remained, to the end, a man of the middle way. In his final report to the Admiralty, he did not dwell on the terror of the Great Barrier Reef or the tragedy of Batavia. Instead, he wrote, "I flatter myself that the discoveries made in the voyage will be found as complete as the nature of the service would admit." It was the ultimate stoic understatement. He had gone as far as it was possible for man to go, and he had done it with the precision of a mathematician and the endurance of a Collier. The Endeavour herself had a quiet end. She was sold back into the merchant service, renamed the Lord Sandwich, and eventually used as a troop transport during the American Revolution. She was scuttled in Newport Harbour in 1778, her timbers sinking into the mud. A humble end for a ship that had carried the weight of the Enlightenment across the world. As you listen to the rhythmic creak of an imagined hull and the distant wash of the Pacific surf, consider the man on the quarterdeck. James Cook's first voyage was the moment the world finally became a known quantity. He proved that the unknown was not a place of monsters, but a place of coordinates, botany, and human resilience. The maps were full, the stars were measured, and as the lanterns were extinguished in the great cabin of history, the silent navigator finally allowed himself a moment of rest. The voyage was over, the world was changed, and the deep, rhythmic silence of the sea remained, as it always does, waiting for the next horizon. Thank you for journeying with us through the high latitudes of history. If these explorations into the discipline and grit of the past help you find your own quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Voyager to support our future expeditions. Until the next horizon, rest well. Good night.